Very much, Andrea, and thank you everybody for attending and for the invitation. Let me share my screen. Okay, I hope that's clear. Okay, so as Andrea said, I was in Polytechnic Montreal for 2.5 years, and now I'm in Florida in Gainesville, and my interests are broadly within discrete optimization. Today, I'll be talking specifically about different sets of cutting plane methods. And I have very deep interest in cutting plane methods. And for that, I have this kind of generic and broad title because I have many different avenues of pursuing cutting plane research. And this talk, I will be kind of informal and going through my own personal experience, not representative of the whole mixed integer programming community. Maybe some people will disagree with me here and there, of what it takes to try to get stronger cutting plane methods into solvers. That's basically my goal, and trying to then impact that way a large variety of real world problems. Okay, so as I said, this title is a little bit, let's say, informal. So let me first say that, well, I do like cutting plane methods, so that's why I put the more in the title. So I like cuts and I would like more of them. So I would like to hope that this talk will encourage you to work on some of these topics. But particularly, I would like the new cuts that were developed to be stronger than the previous ones. And even that is not enough, because there are many stronger cuts already existing in the literature, but many of them do not, or most of them, let's say, do not end up in solvers. And so that's why the practical, and actually more practical part is there, which is I would like to actually deploy those cuts in solvers. This work is based on two papers that are in progress with my PhD advisor, Egan Balch, and Andrea, Shantanu, and Gonzalo. Gonzalo was also another postdoc under Andrea. I'd like to say one more step about my PhD advisor. He was the one who really got my passions within disjunctive programming and cutting planes, and he motivated a lot of my views about what's important research and how to tell whether, for example, a theoretical result should or should not be included in a paper. And really, it has to drive practical insights. And I also know that he had a special connection with Montreal. He taught there. I think what he told me is that when he first arrived in the North America, he was, I think, in Toronto, and then he would drive from Toronto or take the train, I don't remember, from Toronto to Montreal, in which he taught a course. It was either in linear or integer programming, I assume. I don't remember anymore. And he would do this once or twice a week, I believe. And I think even to this day, he has relatives, I believe, in Montreal. And he passed away in 2018, but I know that he had a very strong connection to Montreal. And I wanted to mention that. He talked about it a lot. Okay, let's start with the first part of the talk. And this talk is quite long, so the second part I might not get through the whole thing, and that's okay. I have planned for it that way. The first part will be on my work with Egan on disjunctive cuts, and also on this overview of why cutting planes that are stronger in theory don't always end up in solvers. Let's start off with introducing a little bit of notation and the setting. Discrete optimization is the setting in which we are trying to, for example, maximize something good. For example, as Andrea mentioned, I worked in organ exchange markets, and in that place, in kidney exchange markets, you might want to maximize, for example, the number of kidney transplants. But in addition, there are constraints. For example, you have only a limited number of kidneys available, and so that limits your feasible solutions to your optimization problem. And the discrete part of it is that, for example, the kidney cannot be divided into two across different patients. Each kidney has to go to exactly one patient. So within that feasible region, you're looking for a specific non-convex set of points. And generally, optimizing over these integer points is difficult computationally. So what is done is you relax those restrictions on integrality, and you just solve the problem over the original polyhedron P with the easy constraints, which are linear constraints in general. I should say that the second part of the talk will involve a few nonlinear constraints, but we kind of go back to linear world even there after a few steps. Okay, so there's this polyhedron P, and we optimize over that, and we get a solution X bar. That's the optimal solution to P, but it might not satisfy the integrality constraints. What we can do then is refine our polyhedron with another easy constraint, which cuts away X bar. This cut, this valid inequality, then gives you a new feasible region, and you can repeat the process. And that's the general idea. And this basic technique is fundamental in integer programming. And there was a study done about the various components of a solver, and cutting planes were found to be one of the most important single features of a new generation of codes that kind of came out in the mid-90s, spurred in large part by a generic cutting plane research that was done by my PhD advisor and the co-authors. And one of my co-authors here, Shantanu, gave a very nice, succinct quote to me about cuts. And cuts are like penicillin, and basically you should try to apply them in every way possible. And I like that a lot, and that also summarizes my views on cuts. All right, so I've mentioned kind of that cuts are objects are inequalities that you can generate to cut away a solution X bar that is not feasible to your integer programming problem. Here's how you generate such cuts. At least in my perspective, one of the most common ways is through the use of so-called disjunctions. Concretely, let's say you have your X bar, and in 2 dimensions, it has a 0.4 and a 0.6 and X1 and X2 components. And we want X1 to be integer. So what we know then is that the set of integer feasible solutions is going to be satisfying either X1 is less than or equal to 0, or X1 is greater than or equal to 1 by rounding the X1 component of that solution. And thereby, you can divide your original problem into 2 smaller subproblems. Together, these form a so-called disjunction with disjunctive terms P1 and P2. And I'll be using this notation P superscript T to denote the so-called disjunctive term T. Even if it's not just 2, it could be an arbitrary number of finite terms. And then a disjunction is called valid if, when you take that disjunction, all integer feasible solutions are contained in at least one of those terms. Then a disjunctive cut is simply an inequality that is valid for the disjunctive hull, which means it does not cut away any point of the disjunctive hull. And we will denote that by the closed convex hull of P1 through P capital T if we have T terms. This is what the disjunctive hull looks like. As you can see, it's yet another relaxation of the integer programming hull. And instead of using something like the previous disjunction, X1 less than or equal to 0 or X1 greater than or equal to 1, that's a so-called simple split disjunction. You can use a stronger disjunction. For example, here you might say X2 is also integer, and you can say X1 less than or equal to 0, X2 less than or equal to 0, and so on into 4 terms. And that leads a stronger disjunction, which can lead to stronger cuts. In fact, such stronger cuts from various types of disjunctions and other techniques have been studied quite actively. And just in the past 10 years, here's a subset of the co-authors that have worked on this area of research. But even though there is a lot of research on theoretically strong cuts, what remains the case is that most of these have not been implemented in solvers, as I mentioned. And what we want to figure out is what we can do to bridge that gap. And I should say that although it's true that most of those cuts have not been used in solvers, it's not true that they're completely useless. There is evidence from computational studies that stronger cuts can help. For example, there's this instance Seymour from MIPLib, and it was solved using quite strong cuts generated from a branch and bound tree that was stopped after 8 levels. Then those cuts were lifted to be valid for the whole tree, and they were applied in some manner within an algorithm. And that's how that problem was solved. So we know that if you use stronger cuts correctly, they can positively impact the solution time and the process of an integer programming solver. And the question is, how do we do that generically, not just for a specific problem? And first, I will talk about a few challenges that I've identified, at least within my research. This is not a comprehensive list of challenges. And the first is that when you have a disjunction that is not just a simple split disjunction, you might have this problem of deciding which of those disjunctions to use. In particular, if you're just looking at variable disjunctions on a single variable, you have n variables, then you can choose at most n of them to look at. And that's a linear set to select among. But as soon as you have one of those cross disjunctions that I showed, now you have to look at two variable combinations. And now that's an order n squared selection of disjunction. And already for practical purposes, that's way too computationally expensive to look at all of those. Quadratic is still polynomial, but it's just too slow for how integer programming solvers use cuts. And this is not a new insight. Even in 1998, Sebastian Syria, who was one of those co-authors with my PhD advisor on research that spurred the new generation of cutting plane codes and integer programming solver codes. And by the way, Sebastian Syria, I think, was recently inducted to the National Academy of Engineering here in the United States. So that's a big achievement. He had this presentation in 1998, and he looked at a few challenges that he identified even back then. And already we see that he said, how do we use disjunctions more efficiently? What are the good ones? What are the bad ones? It's very hard to tell. And so that is a difficult problem. But even if we selected a good disjunction in some way, that doesn't solve the problem. Because once we have a disjunction, for these stronger disjunctions, we might have a large number of possible cuts that you can generate. And Bob Bixby, who is one of the Gurobi founders, he had this quote in an interview in 2016. One of the difficulties with cuts is that you don't know which ones to keep, which ones to throw away. Further, they all interact with one another. And this is one of the problems that falls under the umbrella of cut selection, and kind of one of the things that I'm trying to tackle within my own research stream. Moreover, even if you did solve the first two problems, you knew which disjunction to use, and you kind of had a good idea of which cuts are good, there is a problem that sometimes it's challenging to computationally expensive to generate those cuts. And then it's not worth it, because by the time you generate those cuts, you could have used a different technique that was weaker, but then still gave you the same result faster. And for example, from this paper, and I'm not picking on any of these papers, by the way, when I say that something, when I take a quote, I just wanted to be representative of what I think are broader challenges in the literature. So here, Dash, Goodluck, and Bielma have a quote that says that the heuristics they use to separate their cuts, which are stronger cuts, are computationally intensive and therefore not practical. And this is something that generalizes to other techniques that I've seen in the papers in the literature as well. Okay, but actually there's there's further challenges that even if you were to solve the first three, integrating these cuts computationally is not just selecting the strong cuts that you can generate quickly, because there are numerical considerations that arise. Namely, if you have stronger cuts, they're typically denser, and denser cuts can lead to numerical problems when you're solving when you're solving even a linear program. You just add inequalities and they're denser. That linear program will solve more slowly. Sometimes it might not even solve correctly because of how the cuts are angled with one another. And then there's this next step that with an integer programming solver, you don't just solve it using cuts. At some point you say, okay, let's put that tighter relaxation technique aside, and now we're going to start a smart enumeration technique called branch and bound. But those two components interact. And in fact, Andrea here in the audience already mentioned this over a decade ago. It seems that a tighter coordination of branching and cutting can lead to strong improvements. So identifying how those two components work with one another, that's crucial for us to be able to integrate these stronger cuts in practice. And lastly, and this is an opinion that I have, is that in order for not even just numerical properties or algorithmic challenges, the way that we test and implement cuts, it's tightly integrated with the solvers that we test those cuts on. And the solvers are kind of fine-tuned to the existing cuts. So if we are testing them and trying to say, oh, we can do better than the existing cuts, but the solver is already biased towards a certain way of using cuts that is itself biased towards simple cuts that are used already, then it might be hard for us to convince those solvers that the stronger cuts are practically useful. Okay, so among these different challenges, today I will not handle any of them completely, but I will at least try to tackle a few of them. And in the first set of results I will present, it will be joint work with Egon on the first 3 challenges. To recap, the starting point for this research was that existing cuts that are in practice implemented in solvers are kind of simple. They are variants of those split cuts, using split disjunctions or variants of split disjunctions. And the way that the solvers use them, and this was key to the revolution in the 90s that happened, is that you use them in rounds, you apply several of them, and then you re-optimize and you solve again. And by the time that strong cuts are obtained, it usually takes a few times of this recursive re-optimization process before you get to them. And what is observed, at least in some papers, is that after a while, these cuts tend to get more and more parallel to one another, and the condition number of the matrix might become kind of not very nice, and this leads to numerical issues, and even you might not ever reach the integer programming integer programming optimization solution, problem solution, even if you went on to infinity, because you tailed off at some point before that. So with that starting point, our goal was to efficiently and non-recursively generate strong cuts. And to summarize our contributions, we actually do develop a strong non-recursive cutting plane framework using something called the V polyhedral perspective, which is a polar perspective to what's typically been used in practice for generating these stronger cuts. We have an relatively efficient research code that implements our cuts in a specific way. And we investigate this extensively with branch and bound experiments, and also evaluating the strength of these cuts on multi-term general disjunctions, much larger than are, again, typically used in practice. And we also, in the process, identify various cut selection strategies that are dynamically updated throughout the algorithm to figure out which cuts are going to be helpful. I won't talk about all of these aspects because of lack of time, but I wanted to highlight that there are many components of our work, and they're trying to broadly identify good technique, good algorithm for generating strong cuts and how to use them. Okay. I've said that cuts are coming from disjunctions, but now if you are given a disjunction, what's the way that you can generate a cut? And it starts with a relatively straightforward observation. If you have this disjunction, and you've broken it up into several disjunctive terms, then an inequality alpha x greater than equal to beta is valid for the disjunctive hull. So that cut is valid for the disjunctive hull if and only if it is valid for each of those disjunctive terms. And taking that observation, if you let pt, each of those disjunctive terms, that's the disjunctive term t is denoted by p superscript t, and it has this inequality form. Then lift and project cuts, which are kind of the baseline that we tend to compare against, use this observation the following way. Each of those inequalities, those cuts, is valid for term t if and only if there exists a dual certificate by applying the Farkas lemma that certifies the validity of that cut. And that looks like this system at the bottom of the screen. Alpha transpose equals VT AT. Beta is less than or equal to VT BT, and the VTs are greater than or equal to 0. And this is a very nice system because it captures all of the valid inequalities. The solutions in the red, those are variables. The solutions to this system capture all the valid inequalities for your disjunctive hull, for each, well, in this case, for that disjunctive term. But practically, there's a challenge. Once you go from split disjunctions, which is how these lift and project cuts were originally used and tested, to more general disjunctions, those variables VT, those multipliers, cause challenges because you have these variables for each disjunctive term, and you live in an extended formulation, this higher dimensional world, compared to the original world of P, which would be an N. Here you have a much larger dimension of variables that you have to work with. And that's kind of our starting point. What can we do to alleviate that issue? Well, let's look at one of these disjunctive terms. Let's say P2 here. What we've done up to now is we've used this definition of PT in terms of the inequality description. Those are the inequalities defining that term, and it's called the H polyhedral description of a polyhedron. But each polyhedron has an equivalent different description. Instead of using the inequalities to define it, you can use its extreme points and extreme rays. And that's going to be the starting point for our perspective, which is the V polyhedral disjunctive cut perspective. Instead of saying the cut is valid for each term with a dual certificate because of a dual certificate, we'll say that each cut is valid for term T if and only if it is satisfied by all the vertices and rays of each of those disjunctive terms. And this system now is just in variables alpha and beta, but what you have to do is you have to enumerate all the vertices and extreme rays of your polyhedron P, which we assume is it has some at least one extreme point, by the way, at least on the theoretical side. We don't need that for the practical side. And this is called the V polyhedral description. And now the number of variables is the same as the original problem P. And therefore, at least theoretically, that's a computationally attractive option. The question is then, how do we use that in practice? We're going to put this together into a big system, and we're going to call this the point ray linear program, where the solutions alpha beta are going to be cuts. And instead of doing all of the vertices and rays, we're just going to say that there's a system defined on a set of points and a set of rays. And in order to use this system, this PRLP, we have several things we have to do. We have to first choose a disjunction, and then obtain that set of points and rays for that disjunction. And then we're going to solve that PRLP for various objectives and we're going to get cuts. And that kind of gives an outline of our paper. We talk about which objectives to use. We have one way of choosing a disjunction, which is slightly different, a paradigm that's slightly different than what's used for example, for split cuts. And then we also talk about which points and rays to select. Today, because of a lack of time, I'm only going to talk about one of these things, which is which points and rays to select. All right, so what if we used all of the points and rays defining each of those disjunctive terms? It can be shown that even if you have a relatively small set of inequalities defining polyhedron, the number of vertices and extreme points and extreme rays defining that same polyhedron might be very, very large. So it's impractical to use as the points and the rays the full V polyhedral description. And it's also not possible to just select an arbitrary subset of those points and rays, because then you might get invalid cuts. What you can do, by the way, with that technique is you can select a subset of points and rays, and then using row generation, if you identify some point or ray that's being cut away by your current candidate solution, you can then add that constraint back into the system and iterate. And this is called row generation, and it's been tried in this setting with success in the sense that you can get strong cuts, but they also identify the same problem as the other papers, and that the technique is slow. Our goal then is going to be slightly different. What we'd like to do is to select a set of points and rays, not necessarily a subset of the vertices and extreme points, vertices and extreme rays, but select a set of points and rays such that we guarantee that immediately all of the cuts from the PRLP are valid. And what we start with is this is actually a corollary to a different theorem, but this theoretical result that if you have a set of points and rays, such that when you take the convex hull of the points and the conic hull of the rays, every point in each disjunctive term is contained in this V polyhedral set, then your V polyhedral cuts are going to be valid. And this is called a V polyhedral relaxation of each of those disjunctive terms. And with that observation, that's where we're going to go. We're going to try to find a compact V polyhedral relaxation of each disjunctive term. So that's a sufficient condition that we don't yet know how to implement. So let's see what we can do. Here's a three-dimensional example where, again, x bar denotes your LP optimal solution. And let's say we take a split, even though the example is with a split disjunction, our technique applies for general disjunctions. Divide it into two disjunctive terms. Let's say P1 and P2. And what we need is that the union of P1 and P2 is contained in a set of points and rays that we select, the convex hull of a set of points and rays that we select. The idea that we use is to optimize over each of those disjunctive terms. What we get is a point for each term, but not just a point, we actually have an optimal basis for each of those terms. The optimal basis turns out to define a cone. It's a cone, it's a simplicial cone, one with exactly n rays. And we have one of these cones for each of the terms. And moreover, that cone is a relaxation of the full disjunctive term. And if we use that cone, we actually have a small number of points and rays, and we're guaranteed, because it's a relaxation, that each of the disjunctive terms will not be cut away by any of our cuts. And so therefore, the cuts are valid for the disjunctive hull. This is something in our paper that we call the simple point ray collection, and that's the one we work with. And next, at least for this part of the talk, I won't go into too many more details about the other aspects, but I do want to say that overall, the framework that we suggest does enable us to efficiently and non-recursively generate strong cuts. And what we show in the paper is first, kind of what we mentioned before, the PRLP is smaller than the lift and project LP, the method that is used to generate lift and project cuts. So computationally, there are advantages. And in prior work with this row generation, they've already shown advantages for larger disjunctions generated by some variant of our approach versus the lift and project cut approach, and showed that doing this PRLP idea can have significant computational time advantages over the lift and project cuts. Now, from the non-recursively point of view, this goes to the point of which disjunction we select. In this context, we can select stronger disjunctions rather than using a weaker disjunction, getting weaker cuts and recursing. And the idea is that by not using new cuts to generate future cuts, we can avoid numerical issues. And finally, even with this simple point ray collection that I pointed out in the past few slides, we can show strong theoretical results showing that they produce facet-defining inequalities for the disjunctive hull under certain conditions. But all of that is kind of on the theoretical side, and so in the end, you have to evaluate these techniques in practice, and so that's what we'll do next. We'll talk about the computational results with our cuts. Our setup is that we implemented this in an open source framework within CoinOR. And at least for the results that I present today, we're going to evaluate just the strength of the cuts via the percent gap closed with respect to the known integer programming optimal solution that we have for these benchmark instances. And for percent gap closed, the higher the percent gap that is closed, the better. And at least for these experiments, we compared just to the Gomery mixed integer cuts, because those are the ones that are typically used in practice. And they're also, well, one of the ones that are typically used in practice and are also known to be very strong theoretically. We selected 195 benchmark instances, and we used one disjunction per computational run, with that disjunction having up to 64 terms. And recall that in general, really like a 2-term disjunction was used or is used in practice. So we're using up to 64 terms in our experiments. And these are computed as the leaf nodes of a partial branch and bound tree generated through strong branching. Here are some of the results. This shows on the y-axis the percent gap that is closed, and on the x-axis it will be the different techniques. Gomery mixed integer cuts close 17% of the gap on their own for these instances. If we use v-polyhedral cuts, we end up with 15.6% of the gap, which is slightly lower than Gomery mixed integer cuts. And we actually know at least theoretically, one of the reasons why that's happening. And if you have any questions about that, please ask, and I'll talk about it later. But interestingly, if you use both of those two families together, and as we know, kind of in practice, you wouldn't just use one or the other, you would use both of them together, we do significantly better than Gomery cuts on their own. We also tested this within a solver, not just with Gomery mixed integer cuts, actually. We tested with how our cuts, the V polyhedral cuts, interact with whatever Groby decides to add by default. So this is now no longer Gomery cuts, it could be all sorts of cuts. And what we see is that Groby, after the first round of cuts, closes 26% of the gap. But with V polyhedral cuts, there's an additional 7% of the gap that can be closed. Now, Groby does multiple rounds of cuts. It applies these cuts recursively. We only do one. So the question is, maybe after a while, Groby's cuts end up overtaking our cuts and ours are not useful. It turns out that is not the case. So for these instances, after the last round of cuts at the root node, Groby closes about 46.5%, while when we include our cuts as user cuts, Groby is still closing another 5.5% more. So that gap is closed a little bit, but not entirely. Interestingly, in a certain subset of instances, our cuts are known to, can actually perform much better than in the general set of instances. So if we look at the set of instances in which V polyhedral cuts are effective, ones that they close at least 10% of the integrality gap. And notice you can just test that by taking a set of cuts, adding them, and seeing whether they seem to be doing a lot. You wouldn't know the integrality gap that's closed in general, but you would know at least how much the bound is able to change. On these set of instances where our disjunctive cuts seem to perform well, they seem to perform much better than Gomery cuts and other instances, other cuts as well. So there's a complementarity between, it seems there's a complementarity with the set of cuts that we use and the set of cuts that are currently being implemented in solvers. For example, in this chart, I want to highlight that the Gomery cuts close 14.5% for these instances, which is smaller than the 17.3 for the full set of instances. And for the selected instances, V polyhedral cuts on their own already close double the gap as Gomery compared to Gomery cuts. And that same kind of relative improvement continues also with the Groby cuts, which again are very similar, at least in style, to Gomery cuts. Okay, so as a summary of the contributions of this section, we have this V polyhedral disjunctive cut framework for which we have a specific implementation, and it aims to mitigate several of the practical challenges for deploying disjunctive cuts. We have improved computational efficiency because we don't use this extended formulation that are used in lift and project cuts. And we know from these computational results, but also from theory that we haven't shown today, that these cuts are quite strong. And although I haven't presented it, we've also tested our cuts in branch and cut. And within those experiments, it's not so conclusive in the sense that, yes, the cuts do help on average, but it depends on which disjunction you use for each of the cuts. And so there is some future work that is going on in terms of tailoring the disjunctive cuts to correctly interact with the branching component. But overall, even there, we have promising results. And as I mentioned, this is a part of a very large stream of research, and namely, we need to look at better cut selection strategies, incorporating aspects of these cuts and also incorporating branching ideas and other interactions with cutting plane families that are being used. Okay, going back to the set of challenges that I presented before, I just talked about the first three, but this fourth one actually is very related to those cut selection strategies future work that I mentioned on the previous slide. Namely, I talked about before how stronger cuts tend to be denser. And if I look at my disjunctive cuts and I try disjunctions that are 2-term, 4-term, 8-term, and up to 64 terms, if you use a 64-term disjunction, your cuts tend to be stronger, but also much denser than the ones from, let's say, a 2- or 4-term disjunction. And so denser cuts, we would like to avoid them. And how can we do it? And this leads to several of my ongoing projects. First, we can look at computational aspects of sparse cuts versus dense cuts generated in a certain way. I also have a project, most of this work is actually made possible by being a postdoc in Montreal. So I really appreciate the opportunity and the kind of the avenues that I was able to explore while I was under Andrea. And so the second work that I'm working on is a theoretical paper in which you analyze adding cuts versus branching, or a combination of the two in a branch and cut framework, and seeing when you should stop cutting, for example, and start branching. So that kind of question we can explore theoretically in that paper. And that's joint work with another former postdoc of Andreas and a visitor from Montreal as well. And then the last step is for mixed integer linear programs, where do we even get these sparse cuts? And one thing that I'm working on is leveraging some kind of structure in your instance. Let's say that it has a block structure. Well, that block structure has some kind of sparsity. If we generate cuts within that block, we can have sparse cuts, and hopefully we can generate stronger cuts for the full instance without having to have dense inequalities. So those are the three of the projects that I have ongoing today. In the remaining, let's say, 10 minutes or so, I believe I have, I'll talk about just one of these projects briefly, which are computational aspects of sparse versus dense cuts. And it won't be for mixed integer linear programs. Instead, it'll be for the quadratically constrained quadratic programming case. However, the same, some of those insights that we get there will hopefully translate to the linear case as well. All right, so this work is based on joint work with Shantanu Day, Andrea Lloyd, and Gonzalo Munoz, as I mentioned before. And we start off not with the linear program, but rather with a quadratically constrained quadratic program, which takes the following form. It has some n-dimensional variables x and symmetric matrix Q that now you have interactions between the terms. You have quadratic x squared terms or xij terms in there, or xi times xj terms, sorry, in there. And this is if Q is non-positive semi-definite, this thing can be non-convex, and therefore it's a very challenging problem. And it's used in a variety of applications. You can even encompass binary integer programming in there, but it has applications to portfolio optimization, power systems, solving linear least squares problems, and so on. Our goal is just to investigate sparse linear outer approximations to such problems and compare those to computationally to if we use a denser version of the same outer approximation. The steps that we're going to take are first a few transformations of the original problem. We start with what I just gave, and we introduce an extended formulation, matrix X, in which component ij is equal to the product of xi times xj. And applying some trickery, we can actually get that this original problem is equivalent to the extended formulation in which x equals xx transpose. And now you have two variables, little x and capital X, which is a matrix. And this happens to actually be a convex problem, except for that rank 1 condition, x equals xx transpose. What we can do is we can remove that constraint and then add a convex constraint saying that x minus xx transpose is PSD. We're then left with a convex optimization problem, and we can reformulate it using Schur's complement as the x minus xx transpose is PSD if and only if the matrix M, which is a function of little x and big X, is PSD, and that matrix is shown below. So then we have this semi-definite programming relaxation, because now we have that the matrix M is PSD, and that's the constraint that we've added, and it's convex, but it's still expensive to solve. Usually it's solved with interior point methods, but if you have, for example, in addition to the constraints that we have here, but you have some integrality constraints in some of the x's, you might embed your technique within a branching solver here as well, and you might want to get lighter relaxations that are used then later in every single node of your branching boundary. So what we're going to look at is a further relaxation of our STP relaxation, which is a linear one. What you can observe is that not only is the system above on the top convex, it's actually linear in the variables x and big X, little x and big X, except for that PSD constraint. But what we can do is we can replace that PSD constraint with linear constraints. So matrix M is PSD if and only if when it's you can multiply, pre-multiply and post-multiply with a vector v, it's non-negative for every single vector v in Rn plus 1. And yeah, M is a matrix in n plus 1 dimensions, by the way. Or it's n plus 1 times n plus 1. And so that actually now is a linear system. But on the other hand, it's not a finite system because we have every single v in Rn plus 1 that's encompassed there. What we can do is further relax it by taking only a subset of Rn plus 1, a subset of vectors in Rn plus 1. And that is going to be our linear programming relaxation. All right, with all of that, now the question comes to which vectors v are we going to use in our linear programming relaxation? And the first choice, the very natural one that you might consider, are the so-called set of eigenvector cuts. Let's say you have your P, which is just the first part of the optimization problem on the previous slide without those extra constraints related to PSD-ness. And if you're given a solution little x, big X to P, such that the matrix M bar is not PSD, then there exists a negative eigenvector to M bar, and that can produce a valid cut. Specifically, if you restrict VV transpose, when V is the negative eigenvector, to be non-negative when multiplied against M, that will cut away M bar. And let's just evaluate what happens when you add these kinds of dense cuts. Oh, sorry, when you evaluate these kinds of cuts within certain QC-QP instances. Actually, we're going to test a very simple set of instances called box QP instances. They just have an objective function that is quadratic and no constraints that are quadratic. In fact, there are no constraints except for variable bounds. We will select one of the largest instances in the box QP family called SPAR 125. It's an instance with n equals 125, and approximately 25% non-zeros in the objective coefficients. What we'll look at is the percent gap closed, similarly to the first part of the talk, with respect now to a known quadratic programming optimum solution to this instance. I should mention that as a standard practice, there are so-called McCormick inequalities, which are also added into the formulation that I gave before. They're known to be kind of crucial, and it didn't make sense to test how the eigenvector cuts affect the solution process without adding those McCormick inequalities. Okay, what we see here is on the y-axis, the percent gap that is closed for this instance, and on the x-axis, the time over the span of an hour. What we notice is that around 75% of the gap is closed after an hour, but it also seems like there's not much improvement that is happening at that point either. To understand why that's happening, we looked at another metric. So now I'm adding a different axis. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see another axis, which is time. This will be the iteration time for each iteration that you do over the course of that hour. And what you notice is that by the end of that hour, each iteration takes about 160 seconds. So you're almost taking 3 minutes just to do one iteration. An iteration here is defined as adding all your negative eigenvectors as cuts, reoptimizing, and that's one iteration. So the solving time of your LP grows very slow. Moreover, that's actually the majority of the time that you spend per iteration. The generating the cuts is actually quite fast. Okay, so I will speed up a little bit because I'm running out of time. The key observation is that eigenvectors are typically dense. And the idea that we have is to impose sparsity on V and compare it to those eigenvectors. This is an idea that's been previously looked at by a few papers. And we do some variant, not a variant, we do a slightly different approach than what was done in those papers. The first step for our approach is the observation that you can impose the sparsity on your cuts, separate these cuts with an optimization problem in which you'd like to cut off your candidate solution M bar by as much as possible, subject to vector V being normalized and having at most k non-zero entries. And then looking at this, you can do a small transformation and observe that it's equivalent to a well-studied problem statistics called sparse PCA, sparse principal component analysis, which you might have heard, and it's very well studied and has lots of different approaches that have been tested computationally for it. So I should say that it is NP hard, so at least theoretically it's computationally hard, but we actually don't need optimal solutions to that problem either. We would be satisfied with a pretty good solution that is obtained quickly. Luckily, like I said, it's a very well-studied problem, and there are very good heuristics that exist for that sparse PCA problem. We are specifically going, this is a component that can be replaced in our technique by a different future method, whatever is needed for used for sparse PCA at the time. But we call as an oracle something called the truncated power method. I'm going to skip this. Our idea is going to be iteratively using T power. What we do is we initiate we're V that vector V the support V, so that be sparse and components on the matrix M bar. We'll look at that support and look at the matrix indexed by those rows and columns of that support, and then actually get all negative eigenvectors from that. And then we will update M bar. This is all in one iteration by subtracting that VV transpose that we get for the original M bar from M bar with some parameter delta that we set computationally. And we go back to step one with a new M bar. At some point, we might not have any more negative eigenvectors. So we're going to add the cuts and reoptimize. What we will do is we will sort our cut pool by violation and only add the top K of those cuts. So not all of the cuts that we obtained throughout this process, just the top K of them. Empty out our cut pool, resolve the LP, get a new M bar, and return to step one if we haven't yet solved the problem. That will be our algorithm for generating sparse cuts. And I will skip the intuition, but basically in a few words, if we were to set our sparsity level to be the full n+1, in this process, we would be generating all the eigenvectors of M bar. All right, going back to that instance, spar 125.25.1, what we see is that within that first hour, after half an hour about, sparse cuts are able to overtake dense cuts and actually close more gap at the end of the time. And the key to that is that if you look at the LP solution time over that course of an hour, instead of going up to 140, I guess it was, seconds for the dense cuts, here with the sparse approach, it takes only less than a minute per iteration, even at the end of the hour. For lack of time, I won't go into many more details, but I will say that there's further improvements that can be done by observing that sparse cuts take a while to cross with dense cuts. What we can do is actually use a few dense cuts in the beginning. Anyway, dense cuts slow down the LP only a little bit at first and then are hurting the process later on, but they have a very big gap improvement right away. And then we switch to sparse cuts when we say, oh, the LP seems to be getting too slow. Let's start using sparser cuts. So this combination of the cuts is a key part of is the key to our hybrid algorithm, which, as you can see in this plot on that same instance, we are able to capture the performance of dense early on, the very fast convergence, but then also prevent the tailing off, at least to the same extent as dense is seeing, and further improve the solution over the course of the hour. And hybrid does slow down a little bit compared to sparse, but not significantly, because we only use these dense cuts for about the first minute of the problem. We tested our technique against not just spar 125, but we actually generated instances of BoxQP that have not been tested before. We generated larger instances with 200 variables, and we saw the same performance. We also tested it over the course of a day with yeah, so that just shows that the LP solution time still remains manageable. We also tested it over the course of a day with QCQP instances, and we saw even more dramatic improvements there. For example, here, after a day, dense cuts close only about 98-point-something% of the gap, whereas hybrid, it closes about 99% of the gap, which is about as good as you're going to get for these instances after a fraction of that time. And the key to that, well, here's an even more dramatic example. This is a QCQP instance in which dense cuts close about 15% of the gap, and hybrid goes up to 40% and more after a day. The key is that the LP solution time remains manageable. And that's one of the key parameters that when we go back to the linear world, we like to consider. Here, for example, hybrid seems to flatten out, even though we keep adding cuts at about a minute of solution time per LP, but dense goes up to 3 or 4 times or more slower. Okay, to conclude, we had in the second study the goal of trading off strength and sparsity with linear auto approximations of an SDP, which itself is an approximation of the original QCQP problem. And we show with our computational results that it's possible to get the best of both worlds. In fact, you can get a faster solution, faster LP, but one that also guarantees, or not guarantees you, but one that gives you better objective values as well. For very large instances, there are still some future work remaining in terms of identifying how to properly use sparse versus dense cuts. And then whether we're going to go back to the linear setting with mixed integers, with some discrete variables, or even in this same QCQP setting, but with some discrete variables, where you have to account for how the branching component interacts with the cuts, and that's still a completely open problem in my mind. Okay, so thank you for your attention. Do you have any questions?
Thank you, Alex, for this very interesting presentation. We do have some time for questions, so if you have any question or comment, please go ahead.
So I can break the glass and start. So Alex, thank you very much. Interesting. Of course, I was aware of some of these results, but I mean, most of them, but it's good to know and to see the perspective that you gave to everything. So I think you touched it a little bit, or at least informally, but since many people are talking about now using machine learning for cutting plane selection, and I know that, I mean, since we have been involved, and it's also because some of the last part of the presentation that you gave is also I mean, there are other authors that have been involved in some connected things, so I would be good that you give your perspective on this related to the topic.
Sure. So my perspective is that, and I think you share my perspective, is that incorporating machine learning for cuts is a challenging topic, and one of the reasons is that there are different ways that you can even define cut selection for machine learning. First, you can look at one cut family defined on a certain structure, and in that case, sometimes the machine learning is really identifying the substructure rather than actually the cut itself. And so that's one approach, and that's actually what I think you're mentioning with the Ruth Misner et al. Paper. What they do is they generate cuts as a function of some structure, but they use the machine learning to identify which of those structures kind of abstractly are useful. There's a second way that you can actually have the cuts themselves. Let's say I gave you a set of constraints and you wanted, and maybe some features as well. Then the machine learning task would be, it's very related to the first one, but it's a slightly different perspective now. You are given the set of cuts and the features, and you have to identify some number of them to apply. And even there, the question could be in terms of strength or in terms of how it affects the branch and bound process. And then there's another one for cut selection, that's you have different cut families. So in kind of what I was thinking, at least in my mind, I didn't say, is that when I give you those set of cuts, they might be all coming from one family of cuts. And there, selecting cuts could be identifying some aspect of what cuts within that family are useful. But when you have interactions among cuts, it's a much more challenging problem. And so I think this is what, at least in the literature, we only have maybe the first one where we have the structure selection problem. And we also have some cuts like Gomri cuts where people are selecting among good Gomri cuts, but selecting among all family, a bunch of different families of cuts is still something that's, in my mind, completely open with machine learning. In my mind, one of the easiest steps that I would like to take is for my first project here, the V polyhedral cuts. I mentioned that disjunctive cuts have some issues, let's say, with the branch and cut experiments, in that selecting the good disjunction, predicting which disjunction is good is not so easy, let's say. What I can tell you is that for each of those instances, there tends to exist one disjunction. If you generate cuts from that disjunction, then it will help branch and bound time. But predicting which one is good, or if that even there exists even a solution of that type, it's not clear. And there are two components that I want to say. Sorry, this is a very long answer to your, but there's a lot in my mind about it. There's variability that enters into branch and bound. And so when you're selecting good cuts, somehow you have to take into account that there's randomness that might skew your results. So you have to have a relatively computationally expensive approach, meaning randomizing over random seeds or row permutations or something else, to make sure that what you're getting is not a something that's optimized for noise rather than actual structural things. And then the next thing that I was thinking is that there could be a simpler problem. Sometimes you can just ask the following question: should you use any cuts at all for an instance or not? And that's a classification task. And for that, machine learning actually happens to perform a lot better. And I would probably, if I were working on it, try for that first before I go to the harder task of which disjunction to use, because I kind of want to assume some of those cuts, one of those disjunctions will work with the classification task. And then the second part would be figuring out which of them is good. So that's kind of my, in my mind, overview of machine learning for cut selection. I have more I can say, but I think I don't want to give another whole talk about it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for the question. Thank you, Alex, for the answer. Do we have any other question or comment?
I do have one.
I got
one.
Yeah. One of the first questions I thought while listening to the first part of the talk is, how many disjunctions do you practically consider? And then a bit later, you mentioned that you consider, like, for what concerns V polyhedral cut, up to like 64 disjunctions.
64.
Like,
that's
sorry?
one disjunction, 64 terms.
Yeah, 64 terms. So the my question is more like, in practice, you say up to 64, but in practice, what's the average number of disjunctive terms you consider? And does the percentage of the gap you close in some instances like depend somehow on the size of the, say, or on the number of the disjunctive terms?
So Gabriele, it's a good question. It's what I did in my experiments, and I didn't give all the details, is I actually tested a few different disjunctions per instance. I tested a 2-term disjunction, a 4-term disjunction, 8-term, 16, 32, and 64-term disjunction. I also tested 0-term disjunction, meaning like just using the Gomri cuts or whatever the default is. And what I observed for the strength is that as you increase the size of the disjunction, you tend to get stronger disjunctions and you tend to get stronger cuts. It's not absolute 100% correlation, and there are computational reasons, but also practical reasons for why that is the case. But from the perspective of strength, stronger disjunction equals stronger cut, more or less. From the perspective of branch and bound time, better cuts might not come from stronger disjunctions because those cuts are denser, variety of other reasons. It depends on which, so the ideal disjunction to use depends on what your metric is. I think I answered one of your questions. I'm not sure if I answered both of them. What was the other question that I missed?
Yeah, it was more like, is there like any kind of say correlation with the percentage of gap close? Meaning, like, I understand, like, if you add stronger cuts, they are denser, then you get like the linear programming relaxation, which is more like less lighter to solve. So you may end up with gigantic computer resources that you have to use for DLP. But are there any, say, pathological cases where actually those stronger cuts with I don't know, 64 terms disjunctions are indeed closing a decent percentage of the gap in a few iterations?
Yes, basically that is exactly what happens. If you use the larger disjunctions, you tend to close more of the gap. And I don't know if I have the results readily available. No, so I don't have the results readily available, but I used to have a plot showing what happens as you use stronger and stronger disjunctions. And that's, you go from something like 10% to 40% basically, or something. I don't know what the numbers are, but there's a dramatic change as you go to stronger disjunctions.
So in a sense, you have also kind of, sorry. You have also kind of a heuristic choice on this, like the number of disjunctive terms and whether like having more will pay off in the, say, next few iteration of the branching bound tree.
That's why the disjunctions are generated through this partial branching bound tree.
Okay.
So if you start with a split and you look at which of those nodes of the partial branching bound tree with two nodes has the objective value, that like the tighter objective value,
right,
you can further tighten it, cut that point off, and split it off into two. Now you have three terms, and you have a better disjunction,
right,
and so on and so forth. And that process is completely heuristic, as you said. We use strong branching. It's not clear that strong branching is good for the bound, but it's not clear that that's necessarily the best thing to do for cuts. A smart strategy through for a partial branching bound tree would be a very nice aspect of future work.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Gabriele, for the question. Thank you, Alex, for the answer. We have another question from Antoine Legrand.
Hi, thank you very much for your very interesting talk, Alexander. I also have a question about the first part where you didn't get into the details of how you are building the cone for approximating locally the polyhedral. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you're in your results, or if you look at how degeneracy could impact this creation of the cones.
Right. So these cones are built using the basis cone. At each term, we have our optimal solution, and there's a basis defining essentially n inequalities in n-dimensional space that are tight at that point, and that's how the cone is defined. And you can just read off the rays actually from the basis. But if there's degeneracy, if there are more inequalities that are tight there. So there's two types of degeneracy. There's primal and dual. If there are more inequalities that are tight there, what you can get is a tighter cone with more rays. And we started looking at that briefly, but the problem is that it's expensive to kind of so-called activate those hyperplanes and then get the polyhedral description of those tighter cones. And even if you could do that, is it worth it to do that versus just maybe generating another disjunctive term, adding a few more rays from those disjunctive term and seeing if that is stronger? So that trade-off is something that we've been exploring, but we haven't had time to give you a good answer to that. Dual degeneracy, on the other hand, that's another interesting one where maybe you have multiple cones you can use, and figuring out which of those cones is the best one, I don't know. We just select one of them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Antoine, for the question, and Alex for the answer. Any remaining question or comments? Right, then in that case, thank you very much again, Alex. Thank you all for your participation, and looking forward to seeing you again in the next Meet a GERAD Researcher seminar.